Andy Fenner, we're live, buddy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I got to call you straight up. I thought you South Africans were hard. You were meant to go on a farm tour with Darren O'Rourke this morning. I heard you had to have a lie-in because you're a bit tired. What's going on, man?
Listen, it was quite a long haul getting here.
Really?
And then,
how long's the trip?
Well, you fly Cape Town, Joburg, then Joburg here through the night. But the irony was I thought I was going to have a lie-in.
Yeah.
And then I should have known myself better. So I was up and at 'em early this morning anyway, walking around this incredible city.
Nice.
And just drinking like an ungodly amount of coffee.
Yeah, there's some good coffee in the city too.
The city definitely knows coffee.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could have gone, but chatting to Darren outside, he said the thing ran on a little bit longer than he thought anyway. So
it worked out well.
Yeah.
But home's Cape Town, South Africa?
Yeah. So I'm a Joburg boy, born and bred in Joburg, and then moved down to Cape Town to study, and basically didn't go back. So Cape Town's definitely home now.
What did you study?
Well, I use that word pretty loosely. I went to university in Stellenbosch and studied economics.
Yeah, me too.
But actually dropped out of my course in my third year, which was quite deep into the course. Basically just hated what I was studying, or hated not knowing what I wanted to do. Just kind of being there by default and learning out of a textbook.
Sounds a very familiar story, doesn't it?
Parrot fashion reams and reams of sort of boring lists. And memorizing them and not really learning anything.
So I left uni, and what'd you do?
I then talked myself into an advertising school.
Okay.
Studying a postgrad course.
Mm-hmm.
And I then talked myself into a property development postgrad degree.
Yeah.
So I'm in quite a weird
Did you finish those too?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, that's good.
So I'm a pretty interesting CV with 2 postgrads but no undergrad.
No, yeah. How does that then morph into the ethical butcher?
Oh man, it's a very long story. The sort of medium version of it is that I then took the sort of advertising, branding, and property background and sort of morphed them into a ad agency for property developers.
Okay.
I then got into development myself. My old man is a developer. And again, like life was pretty cushy. It was going quite well, but I was just like deeply unhappy, unsatisfied, bored, sitting in a room with sort of middle-aged men while I was young and hopefully creative. Yeah. So I then gave that up and started writing about food. I was the cliched sort of food blogger when blogging was still a thing.
You liked food because you were dining at good restaurants as an ad agency guy? Or?
Yeah. And it really was the cliche of like eventually someone saying you should just start it as a creative outlet, which it was initially. It was just a way for me to write about something I loved.
Yeah, beautiful.
And then that sort of snowballed quite quickly. I got approached by a couple of magazines to write for them. Got approached by a couple of brands to write for them. And then made sort of the decision to form a company with my wife, who's a graphic designer.
Mm-hmm.
So we had sort of, before we knew it, a sort of brand consultancy thing going on. Sorry, this is the medium version of a very long story.
No, we got as much time as you want.
And then we got a couple of cool clients, all food related, so wineries and chefs and restaurants. And then my sort of big break came when a really big retailer hired me as a sort of trend forecaster. And that was the first time. As a
trend forecaster?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was the first time I got put in. I just got put in the meat section by a sort of default. And that was really the first time I was exposed to meat as a category. It was sort of the first time I started asking myself questions that I now try and sort of preach other people to ask, So I pretty much saw firsthand the greenwashing that goes on and the bullshit that's out there in a industry that is pretty much become experts at lying to people.
I agree. What's greenwashing? I've never heard that term before.
Greenwashing is basically very clever PR and marketing jargon for the meat industry or any sustainability drive.
Oh, okay, around saying this is a sustainable product, this is an organic product, this is a...
So it's pretty much using something that's really emotive to sell a product, really, with no principles behind it. That's greenwashing. So I then used that as a reason for me to part ways. I just left under terms that weren't necessarily very amicable.
With this big retailer you were working for?
Yeah.
Because you didn't want to be associated with a product that was...
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't sell a product
that you didn't believe in.
That I didn't believe in, yeah.
Yeah.
But then I took that a little bit further because I was so sort of shook up by this whole thing that I gave up meat.
How long ago was this?
Well, this was before we started Frankie Fenner, so this was about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I
became a vegetarian or a vegan?
I became a vegetarian. I mean, as a red-blooded South African guy, I actually had no interest in being a permanent vegetarian.
Yeah.
But I thought it would be sort of a commitment to finding guys who were farming the right way. And I thought that would last a couple of months and then I'd be back on the meat. And it didn't. It took a year or so of not eating meat and asking questions about where everything was coming from. And sort of running in parallel to this, I was hired as a food critic for a magazine back home and a restaurant judge for quite a big magazine group back home. So I thought I was sort of pretty immersed in the food scene. And luckily I had a lot of chef friends who I then started calling up and saying, like, where does your meat come from? And this was purely like on a selfish level. I had no idea of Frankie Fenner even existing at the time.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. Just so I understand, you had a year off, or a year being a vegetarian. When you went back to meat, what were the parameters around what you were prepared to eat? Was it just a certain brand? Was it just a certain style of feeding? What were the ethics behind your decision?
I just wanted people to answer a very simple question about where the meat came from. That was, in its simplicity, that was the cornerstone of what I wanted someone to explain to me.
Yeah.
And when I started making these calls to chefs, the answer was, we don't really know, or we don't really care, or a combination of those things. So they would just pick up a phone and order a supplier, or order from a supplier, and a box of meat would arrive at their restaurant. And that was the extent of the relationship with the farmer.
We battle this every day of our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the watershed moment for me where I thought, this isn't just a lifestyle choice for me. It's actually a huge realization into a disconnect that chefs are having with the farmers, and by that definition, the public is also having with the farmers. So that's how Frankie Fenner was born, pretty much out of necessity.
Yeah. So you started a retail butcher shop, which you call Cape Town's Ethical Butcher. Frankie Fenner's, where did the name, yours, obviously surname, where's Frankie come from? Your wife's name, or?
It's another very long story. But we started it with another couple. I thought it was going to take 6 months or so to find all our suppliers. It took years. The other couple gave birth to a little girl called Frances, who we all called Frankie.
Yeah.
So this little girl came along for those years of planning, and she was dumped like between bandsaws in the butcheries, and she was dumped between cows in the pastures, and she was a huge part of the journey. But we subsequently bought that couple out, and they fell pregnant with a second kid, and we left very amicably. And now everyone just thinks Frankie is my nickname, and I don't even correct it.
It's a great name. Can I go back a little bit? I want to understand a bit more about how you categorize the good, the bad, and the ugly with meat. Is it the farming methods? Is it the harvesting methods? Is it the people or the corporations that are involved in it? Can you give us a bit of an insight?
Yeah, I mean, in its most basic form, the way that we choose a farmer we want to work with is, how is the animal treated and what did it eat? And to sort of elaborate on that, you know, I see the term ethical meat as something that we were sort of pioneering, or the first people to put those two words next to each other in South Africa. And ethics is a hard one because you need to understand that everyone's ethics are different. But for me, there's a right way of farming and there's a wrong way of farming.
Explain more.
Well, the right way of farming is paying respect to the land.
So polyculture, as an example.
Yes, regenerative farming, holistic farming, understanding that you need to do everything you can to respect the planet, basically. And the wrong way of farming is to ignore those things. And I think you can apply that principle to meat, of course, but you can apply it to dairy and eggs and plants and grains and everything.
Yeah.
So it was quite sort of ballsy of us to go out there and say we're ethical butchers, but I sincerely believe that you can be ethical farmers of anything or unethical farmers of anything. So that was how we launched. We wanted to be ethical, transparent people who believed in meat and consuming meat, but only a small amount of it in the overall picture, basically.
Did you train yourself as a butcher, or were you just running the business?
Yeah, I trained. It's all self-taught, so there are some horror stories. I mean, thinking back to how we actually survived those initial couple of months and years, literally through blood, sweat, and tears, literally a lot of cuts and injuries, and honestly just watching like YouTube videos and learning as I went. So when we opened the first shop, it was tiny. It was a 40 square meter garage. We found a landlord with too much money. He kept his motorbikes in that garage. And we sort of talked him into giving it to us for pretty much nothing. As the business went well, that was our way of like dipping our toe in the water, and it went well, luckily. But then we moved into the bigger premises, and that's when I had the idea that we would start buying carcasses ourselves. Because up until then, we had sort of outsourced the butchery. So we paid so much time to sourcing the right farmer and spoke with so much passion and enthusiasm about it, but we were still outsourcing the butchery.
So you were just getting in carton meat.
Yeah.
Yep. And selling just to retail, or you're selling into food service too?
Just to retail.
Just to retail.
But then we moved into the bigger premises, and now suddenly we were buying whole carcasses. The reason I had the courage to sort of move into the bigger premises was because we bought one of our suppliers, sort of lock stock, broke down a whole lot of cold rooms, moved them to the middle of Cape Town, erected them again, took over 3 or 4 butchers that they had, and they were very clear that they had 3 or 4 guys who came with like 20 years experience, and they did. But what we learned very quickly was it was sort of 20 years of bad habits and 20 years of
bad experience
of like cutting corners, basically. You know, how do we add filler to the sausage to bulk it up? How do we prevent weight loss, by dry aging? They didn't understand anything I wanted to do. So within a very short amount of time, we fired all of those guys and was then sitting with like a cold room full of meat and
no skilled butchers.
No. So
how'd you source them?
Well, that's when I started.
So you got on the knives.
I got on the knives. And just through luck and just passion and some support from the chef network that I had in Cape Town. We somehow survived. That's when we started.
How did the chefs play into it? They just gave you advice, or did they start buying your meat too?
We started wholesaling.
Yeah. Okay, got you.
So I was chatting to Darren before we came on here about my mentor back home, Liam Tomlin, with a big history in Sydney and what he did here with Bank and the sort of food culture here.
Yeah.
Liam was massively supportive of me and showed a lot of faith in me supplying his restaurants, and introduced me to a lot of the chefs who we then started supplying as well.
What was the mission from the get-go? Like what you weren't a meat guy, and as I'm not, like, and coming into this industry, it's full of rogues, it's the Wild West, it's challenging. You clearly were driven by something other than this is a good business idea, because I think most people would talk you out of it if it was just for business.
Yeah.
What did you want to get out of it, Andy?
Well, I mean, I had another mentor back home who is sort of a 4th generation butcher, and he really did his best to talk me out of this. He really did.
Yeah, I bet.
I think we were kind of naive, but also very passionate about what we wanted to say, which was, let's stop living with our head in the sand and actually start asking questions, and hard questions, and having difficult conversations about where the meat comes from.
Yeah.
I think our overriding mission was to get people to relook their idea of what is expensive, and to relook meat as a category. So we actually said the reason these feedlots exist is because there's a crazy sort of insatiable demand for meat, too much meat.
Yeah.
Like I don't think you'll see a better example of greed and selfishness than meat consumption generally. People just expect it 3 times a day, 7 days a week. We actually said that's ridiculous. It's not sustainable. We want people to eat less meat,
But better quality. Yeah.
Pay a premium for it, celebrate it like a luxury item that it is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And respect it, and actually sort of pay respect to the process that got it on the plate, instead of just seeing it as another thing in a packet on a supermarket aisle.
Yeah. If you look at the 3 big issues with all agriculture, but with meat in particular, being environment, welfare of animals, and then human health, which one for you was the biggest driver, or was it all 3?
I think it started with animal welfare. And the shit that we took in the beginning was quite intense.
How so?
Well, we became quite sort of conspicuous pretty quickly because no one else was really doing what we were doing.
Because you were taking a stand and calling out people that were practicing badly and differentiating grass-fed from grain-fed and all those divisive issues. Yeah.
And trying to explain to vegetarians and vegans that we actually had more in common with them. Like, I think I have more in common with a vegetarian or vegan than I do with someone who just eats blindly any and all meat that's put in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely started off from an animal welfare point of view. I think as we got into the journey, I started learning so much more about biodiversity and regenerative farming and carbon sequestration and all these things that I actually think butchers have the responsibility to know about now. But back then I didn't really understand it, or, I thought we were doing our job by sourcing the right meat. But there's such a huge educational element to it now that I definitely pay as much attention to the environment. Yeah.
Yeah. And what about the last pillar of that, the nutrient quality of meat, like and the differences? Like, let's talk the 2, pasture fed and grain fed. Do you have a view on the nutritional properties of those 2 proteins?
Yeah, I mean, when you get into things like beta carotene and magnesium and calcium and the omega-3s and the CLAs and the things that are there in grass-fed beef and pasture-fed meat, I've got big views on even comparing that to a feedlot animal is ridiculous. The color of the meat, the color of the fats, it's not fair to just lump meat into one category, I don't think.
But the average, I shouldn't say that, because the average consumer is becoming far more educated, but by the average punter still just understands meat is meat, and that there is no difference. There's no difference to the environment, there's no difference to the animal, and there's no difference to the nutritional quality. How big, because I get different, I get the joy and the privilege of speaking to amazing people, some doctors and scientists and farmers and chefs and things. And without doubt, most of them will say, like the Puritans in there will say, that pasture fed is absolutely better for the environment, better for the animal, and ultimately better for the human. But the other part of it is that if you take the standard Australian diet, the standard South African diet, the standard American diet, whatever it was, the whole SAD acronym that they tend to use, that any kind of beef is better than eating a whole lot of processed foods. And I'd be super curious about whether you do take that you're better to start if that's all you can afford, because we talked about it before. then sure, eat grain-fed beef. But if you have the means and you look at beef as an investment in your health, in your future, of disease mitigation, etc., then without doubt, pasture-fed beef is the best option for you.
Yeah, I mean, I really do believe that. And to sort of answer the question just now about those different pillars of reasons we got into the business, I suppose a way of answering it is the different kinds of customers that we have. And we get the people coming to us purely out of ethical reasons, because maybe the doctor has advised them that they actually need to start eating meat because of iron deficiencies or something like that. We get people coming to us because suddenly there's an ethical alternative to eating meat. But we get other people coming to us who really don't give a shit about the ethics. They just want the best ribeye they can find. And
best tasting for them.
Yeah. And I also truly believe this is the best tasting ribeye, because I feel like the way an animal is treated is going to have a direct impact on the flavor of the meat. And what it eats is going to have a direct impact on the flavor of the meat. So we get that kind of person. But then the last category is someone who's coming to us, who's either like some CrossFit gym bunny guy or is very savvy with their diet and actually has worked out that the nutrient-wise, this is the best option for them.
It's a superfood for sure. The food service customers, the chefs and the venues that you supplied, and the whole people saying one thing: we care about provenance, we really do. But when push comes to shove, sometimes it is that same old thing. It's about cost of goods and bottom line and those things. How successful have you been in moving the needle with food service?
Sure. Not as...
It's tough, hey?
Moving the needle is a good way of explaining it. It's like, like waking up one day and you want to start fighting crime. You don't know where to start. You got to start somewhere.
I haven't heard that one. That's a good way of looking at it.
And if you say, we're never going to win, we're never going to succeed, then you're dead before you even start trying, really. But for me, it's always been, there's supposed to be a relationship between a chef and a supplier. And the word relationship is supposed to be that, But the romanticism of a chef phoning a butcher and saying, listen, what do you have in this week? What is aged properly? What do you have enough of? What is consistently good? And then having a conversation about it is how I would love the world to work, versus chefs who are quite volatile by nature anyway, phoning and just all wanting the same cuts all the time. And they might go on about sustainability and nose to tail, but they either want the most affordable price or they want the same thing time and time again that the retailer also wants, or the average consumer also wants. So, it's a little bit demoralizing sometimes. But I mean, we're getting there. Literally the day before we flew out here, we met with a chef who's opening a place in Cape Town, and he hasn't even done his menu yet. He's busy fixing his kitchen and doing the interiors, but he sat down with us and actually together we started putting some things together that we're going to be able to supply consistently, because I get that chefs need consistency. Is that difficult with grass-fed beef in SA too? Yeah, it is. Huge varying degrees of size and fat content
through the seasons.
But I also think it's a cop-out for a lot of chefs to say that, or to commit to a certain supplier because they're committing to one cut, rather than committing to a supplier because they like that supplier's ethics, and then having some flexibility around what cuts they'll use on the menu at the time. So we're getting there. There's a huge education aspect between the butcher and the chef. I think a lot of these chefs can still learn from the skills of the butcher, but then the role of that chef is enormous to start educating people through their menu composition. So for a chef to say, I'm just going to order sirloin because that's what the public wants, it kind of doesn't make sense if he's just putting sirloin on the menu. It's up to that chef to start introducing other cuts to introduce to the public, so that the public actually realizes, well, maybe that's what I want instead, So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, but we're getting there.
Yeah. How big, without giving away trade secrets, is your food service business?
What do you mean, like the
number of venues, revenue? Give me a metric just so that I can get context.
Well, our model is sort of, as a business, we move the goalposts so many times that we went from that tiny store into a bigger premises, and then, as I said, just sort of fell into wholesale. But the problem with that is you start doing these huge volumes of meat and you think you're doing an amazing job, and then you check your books and the margin is so tiny that you actually have sweated for very little reward.
Yeah.
So we then moved. So what we did is move from that premises into another bigger facility where we actually bought a building, but then set up like smaller satellite stores. So we've sort of gone back to being predominantly a retail brand now.
Okay.
And I'd probably say turnover wise, as much as 70 or 80% is retail.
Yeah, wow.
And we are quite clear about certain products that we need to move wholesale to help balance a carcass, and that we can sort of offer on a consistent basis.
Yeah, interesting. And then it's an interesting one for us because we're the complete opposite. You know, as you know, we're about 85% food service because that was our core business, and then the 2 retail stores are the balance. But we honestly do believe that food service will always be an important part of what we do, but that the future for us has 50-50 food service and retail, because the retail consumer, perhaps we're wrong, certainly our amazing customers that we have in our 2 retail stores support this hypothesis, but they are more adventurous, they are more conscious, they are more willing to pay for better quality produce, for true food trust, etc., and that it just seems like a better horse to back. And the only thing that will make us deviate from that growth trajectory is if we can honestly get more chefs, because we do have some amazing ones that genuinely do care, and some of the biggest ones in some of the biggest groups in the country. But for the vast majority, they will talk about it. But then when things get tough, it's just a race to the bottom. Who can provide me the cheapest cut of meat that I can put onto my menu so that my cost of goods looks good and the profit, as opposed to saying, I need to start getting better at storytelling. I need to train my front of house. I need to get my consumers being willing to pay for more because my produce is so much better. The experience is so much better. The health benefits, the environmental benefits, whatever it is. I mean, there's so many things that you can get on your soapbox and talk about, but we don't have enough brave chefs that are prepared to do that because they say we can't. The economy's tight, or I've got shareholders, I've got owners, I've got whatever it happens to be. But someone's got to do it, and then we've got to do it as a mass, because otherwise it's forever just going to be this horrendous thing where we have to rely on big organizations like JBS that, you know, we confront with Andrew's Meats every day, that can do whatever they want because they're so big and so ugly that they can sell produce so cheaply. But if people scratch just a little bit below the surface, they're going to see that they're doing incredible harm to all of those pillars that we've spoken about: environment, animal, and people.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think, you know, if I was honest, if you ask me what's the better business, buying boxed meat or buying carcasses, it's the easiest answer in the world. We don't buy any boxed meat.
Yep, you're all carcass.
We buy the whole carcass.
Yep.
We break the whole thing down and we take the responsibility to sell every scrap that we can. But it's so hard to do that. And I think part of the reason is, or not part of the reason, a huge part of the reason is the feedlot industry setting the price point, and then the customer sort of seeing size as value for money. So would rather pay less for a massive steak from a feedlot animal than pay a little bit more for less meat from a pasture-bred animal. And convincing that average South African, I'm not sure if it's the same here.
It's the same in every industrialized country. Don't be hard on your country, man. It is that moronic view of more is better.
Yeah, you pay 100 100 Rand for a huge T-bone, or you pay 100 Rand for a much smaller, well-sourced, beautifully, meticulously curated T-bone. The chef has a massive role in that equation for me.
The chef, I blame the end consumer even more. It's this whole thing, and I quite often talk about this analogy. It's like fast fashion. If you don't like sweatshops in China and Asia, then other parts of Asia, then don't shop at Zara, don't shop at H&M. If you don't like factory farming, then don't go to Coles and Woolworths and IGA and whatever the equivalents are in South Africa. You are the one. People will always do what they can get away with. Like, a company is ultimately beholden to its shareholders. And so if you keep buying that product, then sure, they're going to keep supplying it. And, the companies that are brave enough to go, well, I'm not doing it. The Teslas, the Patagonias, the small organic farmers, and, even the bigger ones like the Whole Foods in the US. Like, there is a business model, and I think there's a undercurrent of consumers that want to do the right thing, but unfortunately are being diverted through very, very clever marketing to think that things like plant-based meat and veganism, etc., are the ultimate solution to a bunch of big macro problems, which I want to get your views on. Meat and climate change, because it's an argument, it's a hypothesis that is so misunderstood, and you've already touched on some of the issues around carbon sequestration and things. But how do you look at it? How do you explain to people that say I want to eat less meat because it's bad for the environment?
Sure. I don't think people understand the importance of soil in this equation and the role that animals play in biodiversity and keeping that soil healthy and nutritionally dense and active. So I'm not a farmer, but I do think butchers need to play a role in this education. But I think in the simplest way to explain it would be, if you commit to a vegan or vegetarian diet because of your concern for the environment, if you're eating any product that is not unbelievably well researched in terms of its source, you could have the best intentions in the world but be contributing to radical climate change by supporting monoculture.
Number one, yeah.
And carbon footprint. So you could be very well-meaning in this, but you could be consuming a product that was farmed in a way where so much carbon was lost as a result of it. And you wouldn't even know when it ends up on your plate unless you've gone the extra mile of finding all of this out. Versus kind of just attacking the meat eater who has given a lot of thought and is very compassionate towards the environment. And is actually well researched and has pretty intellectual views on all of these things. My thing that I always try and explain is, in the 10 years of having Frankie Fenner, I can count maybe 2 people who are willing to sit at a table with me and have this kind of calm, rational, intellectual sort of chat about it. It's a little bit like politics or
it's very emotive,
or religion. You can't you don't often sit down with someone where they have radically different views and they chat about it over a couple of glasses of wine and leave the table respecting each other's views. But yeah, that's kind of as simply as I can put it. I don't think anyone's put it better than Michael Pollan when he said, and I've done so much research into this and read so much about it, and the best thing I ever read was his one sentence where he said, eat a little bit of everything, mostly plants. And that kind of sums it all up for me.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I 100% agree. 2, I think that until we move the argument from plants versus animals and make it about mono versus polyculture, then we're forever going to go around in circles. And, there's a bunch of people that listen to all of our podcasts, but there was one conversation that I had with Joel Salatin, the amazing sustainable farmer from the States, the other day. And he gave this great story that, was literally, if you were living on Mars and you came down and you went to your whole mission was to get a good education. So you came to planet Earth and you went to the worst school with the worst teachers, with the worst drug problems, the worst violent problems. They were allowed to carry guns, the whole shooting match. You would probably go, you know what? This place, this whole thing is no good. I'm better off just staying on planet Mars. And that's how they tend to do the studies when it comes to meat. Well, they tend to do it with everything, all these epidemiological studies and different random studies that don't actually show that some things are done well and some things are done badly. And the other part of the conversation that we had with him is that, and I'm sure South Africa is the same, that there is so much arid land in Australia that we don't have any more land for us to actually grow crops on. So that if you want us to all be vegetarian or vegan, then we need to import all of those fruits, vegetables, and plants from other countries, which is a double whammy because there's an enormous carbon impact of flying or shipping something from elsewhere. And there are 2 billion people in the world at the moment that are malnourished, and typically we're taking food from them. So if we want to have a conversation around ethics about animals and a pecking order of animals, surely human beings sit at the top of that food chain, and that we should be as concerned about them as this hysterical view of killing a cow is unethical. And then he got right into the whole thing about sustainable farming is actually carbon positive. And I don't think most people understand that. Mm-hmm. They don't understand that if a healthy cow eats grass, that it doesn't actually emit methane. But if you have an unhealthy cow that eats copious amounts of corn and wheat, etc., then you're absolutely right. It's like sitting next to a healthy yogi on a plane versus sitting next to a 150-pound gorilla that's eating hot dogs and beers. One's going to fart and one's not, And I think those conversations, because you're right, there is no right and wrong, but there are hard science and there are facts, and most of this, particularly this plant-based movement that we looked at super hard, Andy, because commercially we saw it. We saw the Beyond Burger float, we saw the hysteria around it, but we didn't have to scratch below the surface. Like you look at, is it healthy for you? No, it's literally just full of nasties. It's no healthier for you than I don't know whether you have these things, Chico rolls. I always say it's just a glorified Chico roll. If you look at, is it healthy for the planet? Absolutely not. You already said it. It's from mass monocultured farms that they then produce in big fueled industrial plants. They then freeze it and then they then ship it to the other side of the world or all around America. No one wins. Particularly the end consumer that thinks he's doing or she's doing all the right things, because they're not doing the right thing for themselves, they're not doing the right thing for the planet, and they're not doing the right thing for animals, because there are more animals than the big furry Disney glorified ones that we so want to protect. The plant-based movement, is it big in?
Yeah, I mean, you said so much.
Sorry, it was a rant, man.
Super interesting things there. I mean, I'll say a couple of things. The sort of arid landscape that is deprived of really good soil. The best way to regenerate that soil, ironically,
Put
or the
animals
only
on
way, is with animals.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say just about sort of natural versus unnatural is I can't think of anything more natural than the sun's energy being converted into grass and an animal eating that grass and then being processed into meat for hundreds of people to eat off versus huge tracts of land in potentially suspect farming conditions being put through a monoculture environment to get a whole bunch of ingredients together through all kinds. I mean, it could be any farming practice applied to that. It could be horrific. And then lumping it all together and through processing and logistical distribution, getting it all over the world to then be processed more into a burger to then be eaten. That's when I started the podcast by saying I don't see the one as ethical and the one as unethical, and as simple as that. I think there's definitely a conversation to be had around that.
Yeah.
And your question around like plant-based, it's just blowing up. I mean, it's enormously topical, and it is one of the greatest marketing coups of all time. But I don't feel overly threatened by it. I feel any conversation I can have with a consumer or a chef or anyone who's willing to listen, and that's the important part, is a win, because it gets me an opportunity to talk about why we do things the way that we do things. And it gets me an opportunity to talk about why the meat that we're selling is very different to the meats that you'll find in 9 out of 10 butcher shops or supermarkets in South Africa.
Yeah.
So in a weird way, the plant-based movement has helped us.
Yeah. And, you know, I've got super strong views on it, and they're balanced, I think. But I think that one of the big misunderstandings with plants in general is that for the vast majority, and I'll use Australian statistics because, you know, we've been through and we're still in the midst of this horrific drought. But we've also had floods and unseasonal frosts and all sorts of things, that 70% of all crops that were harvested over the last 12 months were unfit for human consumption. There's two choices. That becomes landfill, and therefore the 23 trillion calories we need every day to feed the human population, which is the science at the moment, that gap becomes even broader, and there's not 2 billion people, there's now probably 2.1 billion people that can't eat. Or we can take that feed and we can give it to ruminant animals that are uniquely designed by whatever deity you want to call, and that they can process that into highly nutritious protein for human consumption. And I think that's a big part of the conversation the vegans in particular either don't understand or don't want to talk about.
I mean, there's a school of thought where you need to understand that the consequence of taking a life, animal life, can be measured against the damage it's going to do. But in this case, the opposite is true, that like the fact that you're taking a life of an animal and actually providing healthy, nutrient-dense protein to a lot of people needs to be talked about and needs to be addressed. And I don't live in the bubble where I don't want to pay any attention to what happened in the process that got it there. I think if anyone that wanted to eat meat asked these kind of questions more, and in an ideal world maybe visited an abattoir themselves and took the responsibility of eating meat more seriously, it would go a long way to solving this. But yeah, I just see them as part of like a holistic answer. It's not the answer, but it's part of the answer. And to just cut them out of the picture and as you say, throw away tons and tons of that inedible food, like, makes no sense to me.
Yep. But even the killing of an animal thing is so binary. Nothing can live without something dying. Like if you clear land to plant crops, then way more animals, and I get there is a pecking order, but it's a man-determined one. We put ourselves at the top. These Disney romanticized animals that have happy faces like cows, etc., and dogs and horses and things, they sit above mice and ants and flies and birds but those animals die when you plant, particularly if it's a non-organic farm and you've got to herbicide and pesticide and place bombs, etc. around it, then animals die in a really long, inhumane, painful way. And people can't ignore that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think if we go back to the example of the vegan or vegetarian eating her chickpeas or, his lentils or whatever, to not understand the damage that's been done to the soil, and as a result, all the animals that were part of that little ecosystem, the birds and bugs and mice and small mammals, like I don't think the average person who's eating that diet is considering that at all. And then your other points of like the world would just be, it would be easier for the meat eater to explain if we were all scientists or biologists or we're all wired that way, that we just saw animals as basically
the same,
storing energy until they die, which is how a lot of scientists or biologists see human beings as well, actually. But we're not wired that way, and I'm not either. I feel compassion and I do form attachments with animals, but I still think you can appreciate the love and respect and care that the right farmer puts into raising that animal, and enjoy the end product.
But what if someone was able to show that by chopping down a plant that they too were living sentient beings? Like, again, it's just we've been conditioned or convinced that certain things don't feel pain, do feel pain, don't matter, do matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just it's our judgment call. It's not the cold hard facts. And there's science coming out now that's showing that even plants are sentient.
Yeah, I mean, I've read amazing things about trees communicating with each other and plants having underground networks and shared energies, and it's it's pretty compelling stuff, But if I see my little 2-year-old girl ripping leaves off a tree or bashing a bunch of flowers or whatever, I'm trying to teach her not to do that, but I will give her a piece of steak for dinner. It's just my approach to seeing the environment and this planet that we live on as a beautiful, holistic thing, that need to support each other.
Yeah, no, I get it. And it's even like we've got this super lovely garden at home and it's got a bunch of weeds in it. And my wife wants to pull them out and I go, I honestly, the old me would have gone, yeah, rip them out there. I go, it's just another plant. Just someone's put a name on it. Yeah. That's a plant. And that's a weed. I go, fuck, they're both green. They're both growing in soil. Why do you want to rip them out for, honey? And they're going to get super angry and just spread and come back in force anyway. So we'll just leave them there. But I think it's these healthy conversations around you're not right and sorry, you're not wrong and I'm right. Like I definitely don't want to say that to anyone. But what I do want to say to people is, you need to get very real about what is the net impact of your decisions. And just reading a Facebook post that was probably written by Beyond Meat or Impossible or one of those people that this is going to save the planet and they've got some index that shows that it's better for the environment, you got to call bullshit. Like, everyone needs to start calling bullshit. Like, I want people to call more bullshit on us. Like we have some of the most educated, incredible scientists and doctors and farmers that come onto this show. And there's enough people that compliment us on the show. I want more people to say, I want more evidence around that, because that's one thing that we really want to do is to go, you know what, push us to actually dig a little bit deeper and to get some harder science around the decisions that we're all making.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no better example than like ignorance is bliss than meat consumption. It's much easier to just look the other way. You kind of know if you scratch beneath the surface around meat and agriculture for animals.
Yeah.
I think the average meat eater, no one is that naive. If you really ask them about it, they'll know they won't like the answers, but it's easier not to ask the questions. But I think knowledge is so powerful in this particular context as well. And I mean, this podcast, I sit in Cape Town and listen to philosophers and nutritionalists and chefs, and it's incredible what you're trying to do with this. But I think to have all these conversations around meat specifically is missing the point, that you need to ask as many questions about farming, full stop.
Yep. Fair point. Yeah, and hopefully we've started that with starting to have some more farmers on, because you're right. It's back to my thing before. It's not plants versus animals. It's poly versus monoculture, and it's ethical versus unethical. And how we define that last part is very different. Super curious about how you view meat insofar as from a health perspective. You were a vegetarian for a year. Did you feel different? Did you feel stronger when you went back onto meat? Did it not make a difference? Did you feel cleaner when you weren't eating? And all those kind of normal throwaway lines that people have.
Honestly, you just end up eating, I ended up eating a lot of very carb-heavy foods. And in the sort of pre-packed category as well, a lot of it is way more processed than I would have liked.
Did your weight change?
I probably had to work much harder at it not changing.
Yeah.
But yeah, just the majority of the food I was eating was processed. And I feel like comparing that to now, where like I always laugh in Cape Town when I do an interview or someone meets me, they kind of expect me to be walking around with like a pork chop in my pocket, or like they think that I just eat like raw meat for breakfast. And like I eat a hugely vegetable heavy diet. I don't really eat red meat Monday to Friday. I eat a little bit of red meat over the weekend. I eat a lot of fish and a lot of chicken, and I feel like I'm cleaner health-wise than and physicality-wise than I've ever been with that kind of approach.
Yeah. So you don't eat animal protein every day?
Not really, no. Or I eat not
across the full spectrum. So seafood, red.
I'll eat animal protein, but often from seafood.
Yeah. And you're conscious of that, like making sure that it's wild, or do you sometimes? No,
I am. So the principles that I apply to sourcing meat, I kind of do across the board for everything.
And it's available in SA?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think South Africans, Cape Townians specifically, we don't really have like a pedestrianized high street sort of environment for shopping. People will get in a car and drive to a center and get out and shop in that center and drive home. So we've had to actually open our shops in those kind of environments. It's not,
so they're in big shopping centers?
Yeah. Well, sort of small enough that they can still feel sort of neighborhoody. Yeah. But big enough so that there's foot traffic. And
interesting.
It's not what we wanted to do, but it's, when we travel for inspiration and we come to Sydney or Copenhagen or London or New York, we draw so much from the shops in those cities, but you can't really apply that. You can't apply a lot of what you see there back home, because Cape Town is just so much smaller than those cities. And like,
how many people?
I don't know, actually.
Couple of million?
Yeah. So it's a case of kind of getting the product in front of as many people as possible. Yeah. So I honestly feel like now, using Frankie Fenner as an example, you can't really say it's inconvenient. It's actually pretty easy to get our product. And I think if you are clever and committed to eating properly and sourcing all your products through the principles we've spoken about today, you can definitely do it.
You can definitely do it. And I think this is the thing, that people get all or nothing mentality. That if I'm going to do this, I've got to just eat that, as opposed to going, just one meal a week. I'm going to eat something from Frankie Fenner's, rather than going, I need to take money from here to be able to afford that. It's that whole conversation around baby steps and starting to think about not just the here and now, but the future. That if you continue to eat what you're eating now because you don't think you can afford stuff from Frankie Fenner's, then just look 15 or 20 or 25 years down the track when you've got obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, whatever it happens to be, because I guarantee you, as pure as the sun will rise tomorrow morning, that a big cause of that is the food choices that you're making today. And just that subtle change of going, this is no longer a cost, but it's truly an investment in my future, should be enough to get people to start.
Yeah, I mean, if we are called expensive, I always try and tell people it should be like reassuringly expensive.
It's valuable, man. It's not expensive. Like, get that out of your vernacular.
It's more like, the feedlot process has taken something that is a luxury item and is supposed to be sought after and expensive and eaten as like a celebration or a luxury, and they've just made it sort of a commodity item and a convenience item that you can just walk into any supermarket and pick off a shelf. So it's sort of going, ironically, looking back as a way to look forward in terms of all the principles we have to return to, which is the way our grandparents and great-grandparents were eating. Feedlots weren't around 100 years ago. And as you say, if we are going to be healthy going forward, that's kind of the area we need to really focus on.
No, I agree. Conscious of time, Andy, the future for Andy Fenner, what's next, man? What's next for the shop? Let's be a little bit more specific, otherwise we get too philosophical. I
definitely see a couple more shops in Cape Town.
You got 4 now?
Yeah.
What's the web address so people can find it?
It's ffmm.co.za.
ZA for those Australians that don't understand the South African accent.
I don't really have. I wish I had more time to get into the project I'm working on at the moment back home.
Which is?
It's a very big, exciting, large-scale food market that I have sort of won the right to curate and design with another amazing woman back home. And it's going to be a huge test to see whether we can take something and build up like a proper repurposed industrial space into a working food market. Cape Town is very good at doing quite polished, sort of curated front end markets without any production happening in that space.
This is like a big internal farmers market style thing.
Yeah, so butchers deboning meat and fishmongers filleting fish and whole fruit and veg and people making cheese on site and roasting coffee and baking bread, and it's kind of
with governance around everybody.
Yeah, so it's a project that's happening at the V&A Waterfront, which is a big very well-known entity in Cape Town, and we've got an amazing grant by the South African government through the amount of jobs we're going to create there.
Amazing.
But for me, it's going to be the ultimate way to take all these principles we've spoken about and put it under one roof with like-minded people that we've curated based on all these principles we've spoken about today. And if that can't get Cape Town to change the way they see produce and the way they interact with produce. And I'm including the chefs as well, because they should be queuing up there for the fish in the morning and chatting to the butchers about what's there.
It'll be every day, not just a weekend thing.
Every day. Yeah,
every day.
So if we can't do it with the bunch of people we've got and the site we've got and the resources we've got and the budget we've got, then it'll never work in Cape Town.
Yeah.
So it's mega exciting.
When's the target start?
September next year.
Is there somewhere people can go to look already? I don't mean site, I mean online.
No,
nothing.
Not really, but
can they just go to Frankie Fenner's for now and get updates? And,
or just reach out to me on Instagram or something.
What's your handle on Instagram?
It's just Andy Fenner.
Andy Fenner.
Yeah, and we're just super excited to as I said, to travel cities like Sydney and all the other places I've mentioned and sort of borrow from bits and pieces that we've been inspired by and then make it sort of relevant to South Africans and contextualize it properly for South Africans and create opportunities for people who wouldn't normally have been able to afford sort of a traditional retail environment or commercial environment is kind of what's driving the project.
Yeah, sounds amazing. What about the meat industry? Where do you think we're heading with it? Is it going to do a 180-degree south turn and change, or are we fighting a losing battle with these large industrialized intensive farming?
I hope we're not fighting a losing battle. We're too far in it now to turn back. So I think, as I said, the plant-based movement is interesting. It's sort of not that anyone back home is getting complacent because it's just such a brutal industry, but it's sort of re-energized a lot of us in a lot of ways, I think. And I honestly think the meat alternative industry, and this is a huge call, but I don't know whether I'll see it in my lifetime, but I think it's going to go through a huge growth stage, and I think it's going to implode.
You're the second person. So Joel Solitan said that. He's never.
Well, he's good company.
He's good company, man. Like, if there's one person that I would be proud to hang my hat next to, but he said, I've never ever predicted anything before, but I honestly, and he almost used your same words. So really? I just wondered whether you listened to the podcast, but he literally said, particularly with the cell-based stuff, that we are so ignorant about what this actually is that it can do nothing but explode and then implode.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do tend to agree. And, you know, I think we finish on that note. It's not for you or for me to tell people what to do, but I think if people just scratch deeper and look at science and look at facts and not just at emotion, because it's nowhere near as simple as people think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to end by thanking you again for getting me on here. It's been super humbling to sit in Cape Town and listen to Neil Perry and Mark Best and even Anthony himself and Darren and then, yeah, hopefully more people listen to this with a bit of an open mind and start conversations about it, because I think that's how real change is going to happen.
We're stoked to have you on, Andy, and welcome to Australia, man.
Thank you.
I want you to sleep well tonight. I want you to be at work on time tomorrow, man. We've got lots to do.
Yeah, I'll get to bed early.
Yeah, good on you, buddy. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.